The first sound I heard that morning wasn't the birds or the wind brushing through the pasture grass. It was wood snapping like a gunshot across my field. I looked up from the feed bucket just in time to see my private property sign explode into splinters under the front tire of a white SUV tearing straight down my ranch road. Dust rose behind it in a long, angry cloud as the driver didn't even slow down. She just kept rolling across my land like the place belonged to her. The driver turned her head for half a second and gave me the same smug little wave she'd been giving me for weeks. That was the moment something inside me finally snapped louder than that broken signpost. 15 years of work building that dirt road by hand had just been crushed under the tires of a woman who thought HOA authority meant ownership over anything she could see. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Because what happened after that sign broke turned my quiet ranch into the strangest showdown our county had seen in decades. If you've never lived on a piece of land long enough to shape it with your own hands, it's hard to explain what that kind of disrespect feels like. That road she just ran over wasn't some decorative driveway. It was the artery that kept my entire ranch alive. When storms tore it apart in the spring, I was the one out there before sunrise, dragging a grader behind my truck, smoothing the ruts so feed deliveries could make it to the barn. When drought baked the surface into hard ridges, I spent hours leveling it again so livestock trailers wouldn't break their axles climbing the hill. Every yard of that road carried the weight of 15 years of work. Every turn in it existed because I carved it into the land myself. And now some suburban HOA president had decided it was nothing more than a convenient shortcut between her neighborhood gate and the highway. The woman behind that steering wheel was Claire Phillips, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Around her neighborhood, she wasn't just a board member. She acted like a mayor, a sheriff, and a zoning committee all rolled into one self-important voice. Claire had moved into the subdivision a year earlier and immediately made it clear she believed leadership meant control. She wrote newsletters about proper lawn trimming angles. She sent warning emails about mailbox color violations. She once tried to fine a neighbor because their dog barked after sunset. Inside that development, people joked about her rules, but most of them still followed them because HOA power can feel bigger than it really is when you live under it. The problem for Claire was that my ranch sat right outside the fence line of her carefully controlled world. When Whispering Pines was first built across the creek, I didn't think much about it. Developers carve up farms, a patch of woods disappears, a row of beige houses appears, and eventually the whole thing blends into the horizon like it's always been there. My land sat far enough away that their sidewalks and cul-de-sacs barely touched my daily routine. The only connection between my ranch and that subdivision was the dirt road running through my property toward the highway. It had been there decades before the first Whispering Pines house ever existed. That road was never part of their development plan. It was never connected to their streets. It was simply a ranch road doing what ranch roads do, moving tractors, trucks, and cattle trailers from one place to another. At least that was the situation until Claire Phillips discovered it. The first time I saw her driving across my land, I assumed it was a mistake. The white SUV appeared one morning just after sunrise, rolling down the hill from the direction of the subdivision gate. I figured some new resident had taken a wrong turn trying to find the main exit. GPS systems send people down the strangest places sometimes. I waved and pointed toward the highway, hoping she'd realize her error and turn around. Instead, she waved back cheerfully and kept driving straight through my ranch like she was cutting across a public park. I told myself it was probably a one-time accident. It wasn't. The next morning, the same SUV appeared again at almost the exact same time. This time, the driver didn't even look surprised when she saw me. She just slowed down enough to give that same friendly wave before continuing down the road. By the end of the week, the pattern was undeniable. Every morning around 7:30, Claire Phillips drove across my ranch to shave 5 minutes off her commute. And every morning she acted like the land under her tires belonged to the community she ruled. At first, I tried the polite route. I walked down the road one morning and flagged her down near the bend where the pasture fence begins. Claire rolled down her window with a practiced smile that looked like it had been rehearsed in a mirror. She greeted me the way HOA presidents greet people they believe should already know their authority. I explained calmly that the road was private property and asked her not to use it anymore. Claire listened with an expression expression that suggested she believed the conversation itself was unnecessary. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Oh, come on," she said, laughing lightly. "We're all neighbors here. What's a little dirt road between friends?" That sentence told me everything I needed to know about the woman sitting behind that steering. To Claire Phillips, the land surrounding her subdivision wasn't private farmland. It was simply unused space waiting to be integrated into her version of neighborhood convenience. She didn't see fences as boundaries. She saw them as temporary obstacles. The concept of property rights meant less to her than the idea of community access. That morning I asked her again, politely but firmly, not to drive across my ranch. She nodded, said she'd talk to the board about it, and then drove off, leaving a cloud of dust floating over the pasture grass. The following morning she drove across again. That was when the frustration started turning into something heavier. Because once someone decides your boundaries don't matter, every small action they take becomes louder than the last. Claire didn't just keep using the road. She started accelerating through it like it belonged to her. Music blasting, tires throwing gravel. My cattle began moving away from the road every morning when they heard the engine approaching. Even the horses started reacting to the noise of that SUV tearing down the hill. I tried another approach. I built a sign, not a small sign either. I planted a bright red metal marker right in the center curve of the road where nobody could miss it. Private road, no trespassing. The letters were big enough to read from half a football field away. I figured even the most entitled HOA president would understand something that direct. The next morning I found the sign lying in the grass, snapped in half, and 15 minutes later Claire Phillips drove across my land again like nothing had happened. That was the moment I realized something important about the woman who had decided my ranch was her morning shortcut. Claire didn't believe she was breaking rules. She believed she was rewriting them, and if someone truly thinks the rules don't apply to them, polite conversations don't change anything. But sometimes the ground itself can, and Claire Phillips was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Long before Claire Phillips ever discovered the convenience of cutting across my land, that road was nothing more than a rough scar running down the side of a quiet ranch that most people in the county barely remembered existed. When I bought the property 15 years earlier, the road wasn't even worthy of being called a road. It was a washed-out trail carved by decades of tractors, rainwater, and cattle hooves moving between the highway and the barn. The first time I drove a pickup down it, the truck bounced so hard I thought the suspension might rip clean off the frame. But that was the thing about ranch life. Nothing arrives perfect. You build it, fix it, shape it, and slowly over the years, the land begins to reflect the work you put into it. That road became the first project I ever tackled after moving in. I spent entire weekends grading the surface with borrowed equipment, hauling gravel, leveling the slope so trucks could reach the lower fields without getting stuck in the mud every spring. When storms carved deep ruts into it, I was the one out there before sunrise, dragging a grader behind my old Ford tractor, smoothing the surface while the mist still clung to the grass. Over time, that trail turned into something reliable. Not pretty, not paved, but strong enough to carry livestock trailers, hay deliveries, and the occasional veterinarian truck rumbling down to the barn. For me, that road wasn't just a strip of dirt. It was proof that the ranch had finally become mine. Every rancher knows that moment when a property stops feeling like borrowed land and starts feeling like something tied to your own bones. That road marked that shift. It was the path I drove every morning before the sun burned through the fog to check fences and feed cattle. It was the route my dog Boomer followed when he chased coyotes out of the pasture at night. It was the way friends arrived when they came out from town with tools or spare parts when something broke in the middle of harvest season. The road carried the rhythm of the ranch the same way a heartbeat carries the rhythm of a body. Back then, the land across the creek was quiet woods and tall grass. Deer moved through it every evening, slipping between the trees like shadows. The only lights visible from my porch after dark came from a farmhouse nearly a mile away. Nobody talked about housing developments back then. Nobody imagined that a place called Whispering Pines would eventually rise where those woods once stood. But progress has a way of arriving whether people want or not. The first sign came when surveyors started appearing near the creek carrying bright orange markers and measuring wheels. Then the trucks arrived. Bulldozers cleared trees by the acre. The quiet woods vanished beneath piles of dirt and stacks of lumber. Within months, the skeletons of houses started rising out of the ground like rows of identical monuments. By the time the first families moved in, the area looked completely different. Where there had once been open land, there were now sidewalks, cul-de-sacs, manicured lawns, and rows of beige houses so similar it looked like someone had copied and pasted the same design across the entire hillside. The developers named it Whispering Pines, which would have been a poetic choice if there had actually been any pine trees left standing. But marketing departments don't worry about that kind of detail. What mattered was the illusion of peaceful suburban living. New homeowners arrived believing they were moving into a quiet countryside community. In reality, they had simply built a tidy little neighborhood on the edge of an old ranching valley. At first, the subdivision didn't bother me. The houses were far enough away that their noise barely reached my fields. Their streetlights glowed faintly across the creek at night, but nothing about their presence changed the work I did every day. If anything, I figured the development might be good for the local economy. More people meant more business for the feed store in town, more activity in the county. I had no interest in fighting progress. The first time I heard the name Claire Phillips was from a delivery driver who had just started making weekly stops at Whispering Pines. He mentioned her casually while unloading feed bags near my barn. According to him, she had already become the most recognizable person in the neighborhood, not because she owned the biggest house or the nicest yard, but because she had quickly positioned herself as the authority figure everyone seemed to answer to. She ran HOA meetings. She organized committees. She wrote long emails explaining how residents should maintain their lawns and fences so the community would maintain proper standards. The driver joked that she had memorized the entire HOA handbook and treated it like a personal constitution. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Every neighborhood has someone like that. There's always a person who volunteers for leadership and ends up acting like the gatekeeper of rules. As long as those rules stayed inside Whispering Pines, they didn't affect me. My ranch existed outside their little system of bylaws and neighborhood meetings. My land answered to county law, not HOA newsletters. The first time I actually saw Claire Phillips in person was one afternoon when I drove down to the fence line near the creek. A group of Whispering Pines residents were standing near their back gate, talking while landscapers planted decorative bushes along the property boundary. In the center of that group stood a woman holding a clipboard and pointing toward different sections of the fence while giving instructions. Even from a distance, it was clear she was the one directing everything. Her posture had that unmistakable stiffness of someone who believed leadership meant control. Every few minutes she would nod while someone else spoke, and then immediately respond with a correction or suggestion. That was Claire Phillips, though I didn't know her name yet. I remember watching that scene for a minute before turning the truck around and heading back toward the barn. At the time, it felt like nothing more than a glimpse into another world. Their neighborhood operated like a small, organized machine, every lawn trimmed, every rule enforced by committee approval. My ranch operated on an entirely different rhythm. Here, decisions happened alone at sunrise while checking fences, not around folding tables in a clubhouse. What I didn't realize at that moment was how quickly those two worlds were about to collide. The collision didn't start with shouting or legal letters, it started with tire tracks. One morning while checking the road after a storm, I noticed fresh marks running straight down the center of the dirt path. At first it looked harmless enough. Someone must have gotten lost and wandered down the road by accident. GPS mistakes happen all the time out here. But the following morning I saw another set. Same size tires, same direction. They came from the side of the creek where Whispering Pines stood and continued straight down the ranch road toward the highway. By the third morning I knew it wasn't a mistake. The tracks were becoming routine. Someone had discovered that my road offered a quick exit from the subdivision without having to drive the long loop through their main gate. Whoever it was had decided the ranch road was easier, faster, and apparently available for public use. That was the first time I stood on the porch early in the morning and waited. And sure enough, just after sunrise, the white SUV rolled over the hill from the direction of Whispering Pines and headed straight down the path I had spent 15 years building. Behind the wheel was Claire Phillips, and the confidence in her expression made it very clear she didn't believe she was doing anything wrong. The first few mornings I watched Claire Phillips drive across my ranch, I still held on to the faint hope that common sense might eventually step in and correct the situation. People make mistakes. People misunderstand boundaries. Sometimes all it takes is one conversation for someone to realize they crossed a line and quietly stop doing whatever caused the problem. But what I started witnessing over the next 2 weeks wasn't misunderstanding. It was escalation. Claire didn't treat my request to stay off the road like a warning. She treated it like a suggestion she had already decided to ignore. The white SUV kept appearing every morning just after sunrise, like clockwork. Tires spinning dust down the length of my road as if it were a paved neighborhood exit instead of the working artery of a ranch that existed long before Whispering Pines had ever been built. At first, it was just her. Then something changed. One Monday morning, I was standing near the pasture fence when the familiar engine noise rolled down the hill again. I expected to see Claire's SUV, but instead a gray sedan followed followed the same path 30 seconds later. The driver glanced at me awkwardly as he passed and gave a quick, apologetic wave before accelerating toward the highway. That moment told me something had shifted. Claire hadn't just decided the road belonged to her. She had started telling other people about it. The shortcut was spreading through the neighborhood. Within days, the pattern became obvious. Every morning, 2 or 3 cars began appearing from the direction of the Whispering Pines back gate. Some drivers looked embarrassed when they noticed me watching from the fence line. Others behaved like Claire herself, driving confidently, as if the path had always been open for community use. The ranch road was quietly turning into a traffic lane for a neighborhood that had never been invited to use it. That was when I decided to make the boundary unmistakable. I built the sign on a Saturday afternoon using scrap metal from the equipment shed and bright red paint I normally used for marking fence posts. The letters were big enough to read from halfway down the hill. Private road, no trespassing. I planted the sign directly in the curve where every vehicle had to slow down before entering the lower stretch of the road. There was no way to miss it. Even someone glancing down at their phone would have seen the red warning standing in the middle of the dirt path. The next morning, the sign was gone. First, I assumed someone had knocked it down accidentally while trying to turn around. But when I walked along the roadside, I found the metal post lying in the grass 30 yards away, with the sign itself snapped clean in half. The paint had been scraped by a tire before the pieces were dragged aside. Whoever destroyed it hadn't done so by accident. They had run straight through it, and right on schedule. At 7:30 that same morning, Claire Phillips drove past the broken pieces without even slowing down. That was the moment when the situation stopped feeling like an inconvenience and started feeling like deliberate disrespect. Someone doesn't drive over a bright red sign by mistake. Someone does that when they want to send a message. I decided to confront her again. The opportunity arrived 2 days later when I heard the engine climbing the hill earlier than usual. I drove my pickup to the bend in the road and parked across the path so she couldn't pass without stopping. When the white SUV appeared a minute later, Claire slammed on her brakes just short of the truck. The expression on her face looked less surprised than annoyed, as if my presence had interrupted something she considered routine. She rolled down her window halfway and gave me the same smile she had used during our first conversation. It was the smile of someone who believed charm could smooth over anything. "Morning," she said casually. "Something wrong with the road today?" I walked up to the driver's side door and rested one hand on the top of the pickup truck. I kept my voice calm, even though the frustration had been building for weeks. "Yes," I said. "What's wrong is that you keep driving across private property after I asked you not to." For a moment, she just stared at me like I had spoken in another language. Then she leaned back slightly and folded her arms. "Oh, come on," she said again, repeating the same dismissive tone she had used before. "It's just a dirt road. We're neighbors. There's no reason to make this complicated." I pointed down the road toward the pasture fence. "That dirt road feeds my ranch," I replied, "and it doesn't belong to your neighborhood." Claire tilted her head slightly as if considering the situation for the first time. Then she said something that explained everything about how she saw the world. "Well," she said slowly, "I'll have to bring it up with the board." The way she said that word, board, sounded less like a casual comment and more like a declaration of authority. I stepped back from the SUV. "You don't need a board meeting," I said. "You need to stop using the road." She didn't answer. Instead, she put the SUV into reverse, backed up a few feet, and then swung the wheel around to drive across the pasture grass instead of the road. Her tires left 2 long scars through the edge of my field before she rejoined the dirt path and accelerated down toward the highway. That maneuver told me everything I needed to know about how she planned to handle the situation. But what happened next went far beyond anything I expected. 3 days later, I returned from the feed store and saw something strange happening near the entrance of the road. Several people were standing beside a folding table just inside my property line. One of them was Claire Phillips. The others were residents from Whispering Pines. They had clipboards, coffee cups, and stacks of printed papers spread across the table like they were organizing a neighborhood event. I pulled the truck to a stop and stepped out. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. Claire turned toward me with the confident smile of someone who believed she had already solved the problem. "Oh, good," she said. "You're here. We're just conducting a quick community vote." I stared at her. "A vote for what?" She lifted one of the papers from the table and tapped it with a pen. "The board believes it would benefit everyone if this road became shared access for Whispering Pines residents. It would reduce congestion at the main gate and improve overall neighborhood traffic flow." For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. "You're voting on my road?" I asked. Claire nodded calmly. "Well, technically it's a proposal right now," she said. "But once the community approves it, we can submit the motion to the county." The other residents standing near the table shifted awkwardly, but none of them said a word. Claire had clearly framed the situation as a routine neighborhood improvement project. I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd I couldn't think of any other reaction. "You can't vote on someone else's property," I said. Claire's smile tightened slightly. "It's "It's not about ownership," she replied. "It's about community integration." That sentence hung in the air like a warning, because in Claire Phillips's world, community authority didn't stop at the subdivision fence. And if she believed the HOA had the power to redraw property boundaries with a clipboard and a vote, then this situation was about to become a lot bigger than a broken sign and a dusty shortcut. That ridiculous little community vote Claire Phillips tried to hold on my property did something important inside my head that afternoon. Up until that moment, I had still been treating the situation like a stubborn neighbor problem, annoying, disrespectful, but ultimately small enough that common sense might still settle it. But watching her stand there with that folding table and those printed papers, acting like my land was just another HOA project waiting for committee approval, flipped a switch in my mind. Because that was no longer a misunderstanding. That was someone actively trying to manufacture authority where none existed. And the most dangerous thing about people like Claire Phillips is that they believe paperwork equals power. They believe if they print enough documents and say the word board enough times, reality will eventually bend around them. That evening after the sun dropped behind the hills, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and thought about everything that had happened since the white SUV first appeared on my road. The morning traffic from Whispering Pines, the folding table vote on my property like it was a park pavilion. It all added up to one thing. Claire wasn't bluffing. She genuinely believed the HOA could claim my road if she pushed hard enough. And if she believed that, then she was going to keep pushing until someone proved her wrong. The mistake she made was assuming nobody would check the histories of that land. Early the next morning, I climbed into my truck and drove into town before the courthouse even opened. Our county clerk's office sits inside an old brick building that still smells like paper and dust from decades of records stacked in metal cabinets. It's the kind of place where property history lives quietly in folders nobody touches unless something important happens. When I walked through the door, the clerk behind the counter looked up from her computer and recognized me immediately. Small towns work like that. People notice when something unusual starts happening on a ranch outside the county line. "What can I help you find?" she asked. "I need every document tied to my property line," I said, "especially anything connected to the Whispering Pines development." She raised one eyebrow slightly, the way someone does when they already know there's a story behind the request. "HOA trouble?" she asked. I nodded once. She disappeared into the archive room and came back 20 minutes later, pushing a cart stacked with file boxes. Old survey maps, deeds, construction permits, development agreements, everything that had ever been recorded for the land surrounding my ranch. I spent the next 4 hours sitting at a wooden table flipping through those documents one by one. Most of the records simply confirmed what I already knew. My ranch property had been private agricultural land for generations before I bought it. The dirt road Claire had been driving across was clearly marked in every map as a ranch access route, not a public roadway. There were no shared easements, no transportation corridors, nothing that even remotely suggested the subdivision had legal access through my land. But the real discovery came when I opened a thin folder buried near the bottom of one of the file boxes. Inside was a document dated nearly 50 years earlier, back when the first developers bought the land across the creek to build what eventually became Whispering Pines. It was an easement agreement filed with the county during the subdivision approval process. At first glance, it looked like typical development paperwork, but halfway down the page, one paragraph caught my attention. I read it once, then I read it again, slower, and the third time I reached the bottom of that paragraph, I leaned back in the chair and started laughing right there in the clerk's office, because the developers who built Whispering Pines had signed a legally binding contract with the county that solved my entire problem before it even started. According to the agreement, the subdivision was required to construct its own dedicated access road, connecting the neighborhood directly to the highway. In exchange for that approval, the developers agreed that no existing agricultural roads in the surrounding area could ever be used as community traffic routes. The document specifically prohibited residents from using private ranch roads as neighborhood shortcuts, which meant Claire Phillips's entire community integration fantasy wasn't just wrong. It was illegal from the moment she suggested it. The best part was the final detail printed at the bottom of the page. The contract had never been revoked. The county seal was still valid, and that agreement still applied to Whispering Pines today. I made 3 certified copies of the document before leaving the building that afternoon. One copy went into my truck glove compartment, one went into a folder on my kitchen table, and the third one I slipped into a clear plastic sleeve just to keep it protected, because I knew exactly who needed to read it. On the drive back to the ranch, the entire situation started making sense in a way it hadn't before. Claire Phillips wasn't some evil mastermind plotting a land takeover. She was something far more dangerous. She was confident without being informed. She had convinced herself that HOA leadership meant legal authority, that if enough neighbors agreed with her, property lines would somehow shift in their favor. That confidence had allowed her to stand on my land holding a clipboard and talk about community access like it was a simple administrative update. But the truth buried in those county records told a very different story. Not only did she have no authority to claim my road, her neighborhood had legally promised the county decades ago they would never use it, which meant every single time Claire Phillips drove across my ranch after that agreement existed, she wasn't just ignoring a request, she was trespassing. And every letter she printed with that HOA logo threatening me with community guidelines wasn't a warning. It was evidence. That realization changed the entire strategy in my mind. Up until that point, I had been reacting to Claire's actions, blocking the road, replacing signs, arguing at the fence line. But now the situation had flipped, because when someone builds their authority on loud confidence instead of actual facts, the moment you uncover the truth, they collapse under their own weight. Claire Phillips still believed she was winning. She still believed her HOA vote meant something. She still believed my ranch road was about to become a neighborhood shortcut, and she had absolutely no idea that the proof destroying that entire illusion was sitting on my kitchen table, waiting for the right moment to appear. The only question left was when to show it to her. But before that happened, Claire was about to make one more mistake. The kind of mistake that doesn't just embarrass someone, the kind that sinks them completely. The strange thing about arrogance is that it blinds people to the exact moment the ground starts disappearing beneath their feet. Claire Phillips spent weeks acting like my ranch road was already part of Whispering Pines infrastructure. She spoke about it with the confidence of someone announcing a neighborhood improvement project instead of trespassing across private farmland. She believed paperwork and committee votes would eventually push me into surrendering something she had no legal right to touch. But arrogance always carries one fatal weakness. It assumes the other person will keep playing defense forever. Claire believed she could keep pushing until I gave up. What she didn't realize was that I had already stopped reacting and started planning. The morning after I returned from the county clerk's office, I called the only person I knew who would appreciate exactly how ridiculous the situation had become. Derek Miller had been my closest friend since high school, and the only man in the county who owned both a backhoe and a sense of humor dark enough to match mine. When he answered the phone, I didn't bother explaining the entire story again. Derek had already heard the highlights through town gossip and a few conversations at the feed store. "You still having that HOA problem?" he asked. "Not a problem," I said calmly. "A lesson waiting to happen." There was a pause on the line before Derek chuckled. "What kind of lesson?" "The kind that involves digging." An hour later, his pickup truck rolled into my driveway with the backhoe rattling behind it on a flatbed trailer. Derek climbed out, grinning like someone who already knew this was going to be one of those stories people repeat for years. We walked down the road together, studying the terrain the same way ranchers study land before building a fence line. The curve halfway down the hill was exactly where Claire always accelerated after leaving the subdivision gate. The slope dipped slightly there, and the soil stayed loose after rainstorms. It was the perfect spot for an erosion trench that had honestly needed digging for years. Derek looked at the bend and then looked back at me. "You're serious about this?" he said. I nodded once. "She wants a road," I replied. "Let's give her one." The backhoe roared to life, and the first scoop of dirt tore into the ground like the opening note of a song that had been waiting weeks to start. Derek worked carefully, carving a trench wide enough to stop a vehicle, but shallow enough to avoid doing real damage to anything heavier than pride. The machine clawed through the dirt, while I stood nearby, marking the edges and packing the loose soil aside. By late afternoon, the trench stretched across the road like a quiet warning hidden inside the earth. From a distance, it looked harmless. Up close, it looked like gravity waiting for a mistake. We covered the trench with plywood and packed loose dirt across the surface, so the road looked exactly the way it had the day before. Even standing directly beside it, you had to know what you were looking for to notice the difference. Derek shut down the backhoe and climbed down from the seat, wiping sweat from his forehead while admiring the work. "That's going to ruin someone's morning," he said. "Only one person," I replied. Before heading back to the house, we set 2 trail cameras in the brush overlooking the road. If Claire Phillips believed she was driving across my land with authority, I wanted every second of the next part recorded. The following morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm that ranch mornings always carry. The sun crawled slowly over the hills while cattle moved through the pasture grass like dark shadows. house. Derek showed up early with a box of donuts and 2 folding chairs. We carried them down to the barn and sat behind a stack of hay bales that overlooked the curve in the road. Waiting for something ridiculous can be strangely peaceful. At exactly 7:28, the familiar engine noise rolled down the hill. Derek leaned forward slightly. "Right on schedule," he whispered. The white SUV appeared at the crest of the road 30 seconds later, sunlight flashing across the windshield as Claire Phillips accelerated down the slope toward the bend. Even from a distance, I could see her phone pressed against her ear while she talked animatedly to whoever was listening on the other end of the call. She wasn't watching the road. She wasn't watching the land. She was driving with the confidence of someone who had convinced herself that everything in front of her belonged to the community she represented. The front tires reached the trench first. There was a sharp cracking sound as the plywood gave way under the weight of the vehicle. For half a second, the SUV seemed to pause in confusion. Then the front end dropped straight into the hole with a violent thud that echoed across the pasture. Dust exploded into the air. The rear wheels lifted briefly before slamming back against the dirt behind the trench. For a moment, everything went silent. Then Claire Phillips screamed. The driver's door flew open, and she stumbled out of the SUV, clutching her phone, like it might somehow fix what had just happened. The front half of the vehicle sat buried in the trench, while the back tires spun uselessly in the dirt. Claire stared at the hole, then at the road, then back at the hole again, as if the earth itself had betrayed her. Derek collapsed backward in the folding chair, laughing so hard he nearly knocked over the hay bales. "Did you see her face?" he wheezed. I didn't answer. I was too busy watching the realization slowly dawn on Claire Phillips. Because the moment she looked up and saw me standing beside the barn, she understood exactly where she was, on someone else's property. Her voice carried across the pasture as she started shouting into the phone. "Someone sabotaged the road!" she yelled. "This is criminal!" Within 15 minutes, the county sheriff's cruiser appeared at the top of the hill, lights flashing softly as it rolled down toward the trench. Sheriff Cole Matthews stepped out of the vehicle with the calm expression of a man who had spent 30 years watching people create their own disasters. Claire rushed toward him immediately. "This man dug a trap!" she shouted, pointing toward me. "My car is destroyed!" Cole looked at the SUV half buried in dirt. Then he looked at the road. Then he looked at me. "Morning," he said casually. "Morning," I replied. Claire stared between us like she couldn't believe the conversation wasn't immediately turning into an arrest. "That hole is illegal," she insisted. "This road belongs to the community." Sheriff Cole removed a folded county map from his cruiser and spread it across the hood. He studied it quietly for a moment before tracing a finger along property line. Then he looked up at Claire. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this road belongs to him." For the first time since the SUV disappeared into the trench, Claire Phillips had no response. Because the moment the sheriff confirmed the truth, everything she had been pretending collapsed right there in the dust, and the people from Whispering Pines who had gathered near the fence line watching the scene unfold suddenly realized their HOA president had just driven straight into a hole she had absolutely no right to be near. You would think sinking the front half of an HOA president's SUV into a trench on private property would finally convince someone to stop pushing their luck. You would think the sheriff calmly explaining property lines in front of half the neighborhood would be enough humiliation for a single lifetime. But arrogance doesn't retreat after a fall. It doubles down. And Claire Phillips was exactly the kind of person who believed the problem wasn't her behavior. The problem in her mind was that reality hadn't adjusted itself to match her authority yet. The morning after the trench incident proved that, beyond any doubt. I walked down to the mailbox just after sunrise, expecting bills, advertisements, maybe a seed catalog from the feed store in town. Instead, I found a thick white envelope stamped with the Whispering Pines HOA logo in bold blue ink. The return address included Claire's name and the title she loved more than anything else in the world, President. I stood there on the gravel driveway for a moment, staring at it before opening flap. Inside was a printed notice accusing me of environmental negligence. According to the letter, the trench I had dug across my road represented a hazardous obstruction threatening the safety of Whispering Pines residents. The document claimed my actions violated community landscaping standards and demanded immediate restoration of the road. At the bottom of the page was a fine schedule threatening $100 per day until the hazard was removed. I read the entire thing twice before letting out a slow breath and laughing quietly to myself. The woman who had driven her own SUV into a trench on someone else's land was now trying to fine the property owner for digging. That moment told me two things. First, Claire Phillips had absolutely no intention of admitting she was wrong. And second, she still believed the letters she printed carried carried real authority outside the gates of Whispering Pines. That belief was about to cost her more than embarrassment. I carried the letter into the kitchen and placed it on the table beside the easement document I had copied from the county clerk's office. The two papers sitting next to each other told a very interesting story. On one side was Claire's accusation built entirely on HOA rules that applied only inside her subdivision. On the other side was a legally binding county agreement signed decades earlier, proving the subdivision had absolutely no right to use my road in the first place. It was the kind of contrast that lawyers enjoy more than farmers, which is why the next phone call I made that morning wasn't to Derek Miller or the sheriff's department. It was to the office of Mara Pritchard. Mara had been practicing property law in our county longer than Whispering Pines had existed. If someone tried to claim land they didn't own, she was the person people called. Her office sat on the second floor of a small brick building near the courthouse square, filled with filing cabinets and framed certificates documenting years of legal battles over fences, water rights, and land boundaries. When I walked through her door, carrying Claire's letter and the easement contract, she studied both documents quietly for a few minutes. Then she leaned back in her chair and smiled in a way that made it very clear she enjoyed situations exactly like this. "So," she said calmly, "an HOA president trespasses across your property, ignores warning signs, destroys your private roadmark, drives her vehicle into a trench on land she doesn't own, and now she's trying to fine you for it. That about sums it up," I replied. Mara tapped the easement agreement with one finger. "Then you're not the one with the problem," she said. "She is." What followed over the next hour was the kind of strategic planning Claire Phillips never saw coming. Mara explained that HOA rules only apply to properties inside the HOA. My ranch wasn't part of Whispering Pines, which meant Claire's letter had no legal authority whatsoever. But the more interesting part of the situation was how many mistakes Claire had already made while trying to intimidate me. Every time she sent a letter claiming authority she didn't have, she created evidence of harassment. Every time she encouraged residents to drive across my land, she created additional trespassing violations. And every time she publicly insisted the road belonged to the community, she built a record of false claims against a private property owner. Mara opened a blank document on her computer and began typing. "What she expects," she said while writing, "is that you'll get tired of the hassle and give in. What she doesn't expect is someone pushing back through the legal system." The first document she prepared was a cease and desist order addressed directly to Claire Phillips and the Whispering Pines HOA board. It demanded that all residents immediately stop using my road and warned that any further trespassing would trigger a civil lawsuit. Attached to the letter was a certified copy of the easement agreement proving the subdivision had legally agreed never to use ranch roads like mine. The second document was even more interesting. It was a formal notice of legal action outlining potential claims for property damage, harassment, and unlawful trespassing. Claire's broken sign, the camera footage of her vehicle crossing my land, and her own threatening letters were all listed as evidence. When Mara finished printing the documents, she slid them across the desk toward me. "Once these are delivered," she said calmly, "your HOA president has two choices. She can back down quietly, or she can walk into a courtroom and explain why she thinks community votes override county property law." The papers were delivered by certified mail that afternoon, and Claire Phillips chose the second option. 2 days later, another envelope appeared in my mailbox, this one bearing the name of a supposed legal representative for Whispering Pines. The letter inside threatened lawsuits, property seizure claims, and a long list of dramatic legal phrases clearly pulled from online templates. The signature at the bottom read, "Douglas Phillips, Legal Counsel." Derek happened to be standing beside me when I opened that letter. He read the name once and started laughing so hard he had to sit down on the porch steps. "That's her cousin," he said between breaths. "The guy who sells insurance downtown." Apparently, Claire's response to receiving a cease and desist order from an actual attorney was to recruit a relative who had never practiced law in his life. When I showed the letter to Mara the following morning, she barely made it halfway through the first page before shaking her head. "He's not licensed to practice law," she said. "Does that matter?" I asked. "It matters a lot," she replied. Her response to Douglas Phillips was short and devastating. She informed him that representing clients without proper credentials violated state law. law and advised him to immediately cease issuing legal threats on behalf of the HOA. A copy of the notice was sent to the County Bar Association for review. That was the moment the balance of power shifted completely, because the board members of Whispering Pines had originally supported Claire under the assumption she knew what she was doing. They believed her when she said the ranch road could be integrated into the community through a simple vote. They believed her when she insisted the HOA had authority over the surrounding land. But when certified legal documents started arriving explaining exactly how wrong those assumptions were, the board suddenly realized they had been following a leader who never checked the facts. Within a week, an emergency HOA meeting was scheduled. Claire arrived expecting support. Instead, she walked into a room filled with nervous board members who had just learned their neighborhood might be involved in a lawsuit, trespassing, and harassment. By the time that meeting ended, the woman who once introduced herself as the face of Whispering Pines was no longer sitting at the head of the table, because when someone builds their authority on noise instead of knowledge, the moment real expertise enters the room, their power disappears almost instantly, and Claire Phillips had just discovered that lesson the hard way. The strange thing about battles like this is that the loudest part always happens in the middle. The shouting, the threats, the dramatic speeches about authority and community rules all explode while the conflict is still alive, but the ending rarely arrives with the same noise. Real endings are quiet. They arrive slowly, like dust settling after a truck drives past, and that's exactly how the situation with Claire Phillips finally ended. The Whispering Pines HOA meeting that removed her from leadership didn't become a public spectacle. No one posted videos, no one held rallies in the cul-de-sac. It was simply a closed-door meeting where nervous board members finally read the documents they should have examined weeks earlier. The easement agreement Mara had uncovered made the entire situation painfully clear. The subdivision had legally promised the county it would never use surrounding ranch roads as neighborhood traffic routes. Claire's entire campaign to claim my road wasn't just misguided, it was a direct violation of the agreement that allowed Whispering Pines to exist in the first place. Once that reality hit the board members, their support for her collapsed instantly. People who had been nodding along during her speeches about community integration suddenly realized they had been standing on the wrong side of a property dispute that could end in court. Claire tried to argue, of course. According to Derek, who heard the details from a neighbor later, she spent most of that meeting insisting the situation had been misunderstood. She said the road wasn't being taken, only shared. She said the rancher next door was overreacting. She said the HOA had every right to explore options that benefited residents. But the problem with arguments like that is they collapse the moment someone points at an actual document. And once the board members saw the contract with the county seal stamped across the bottom, Claire's authority evaporated like water on hot pavement. By the time the meeting ended, she was no longer president of the Whispering Pines HOA. Word of that decision spread through the county faster than the original trench incident. Small towns thrive on stories like that. The idea that the woman who spent months trying to claim someone else's road had been removed from her own leadership position was too perfect not to repeat. People at the feed store started referring to the situation simply as the trench story. Truck drivers laughed about it while loading hay bales. Even Sheriff Cole mentioned it once while we ran into each other at the gas station town. "Haven't seen that white SUV around lately?" he said casually. "Probably found a road she actually owns," I replied. He nodded once and smiled. The legal case Mara prepared never even needed to reach the courtroom. After Claire lost her position, the new HOA board contacted Mara directly and agreed to settle the entire matter quietly. They issued a written apology, acknowledging the road belonged entirely to my ranch, and confirmed that Whispering Pines residents would no longer use it for any purpose. They also paid for the cost of replacing the sign Claire had run over and covered Mara's legal fees as part of the settlement. The document was signed by the new HOA president and filed with the county clerk so the agreement would remain on record permanently. Claire Phillips never signed that paper. By that time, she had already begun packing boxes inside her house. The rumor around town was that she planned to move somewhere farther south, where the communities were larger and HOA boards carried more influence. I never confirmed the details. I didn't need to. One afternoon about a month after the trench incident, I watched a moving truck pull into Whispering Pines while I was repairing a fence near the creek. Workers carried furniture down the driveway while Claire stood beside the truck with her arms folded, watching everything disappear into cardboard boxes. From where I stood across the pasture, she looked smaller than she had the day she stood at that folding table talking about voting on my road. She never looked in my direction. 2 hours later, the moving truck rolled past the the edge of my property, headed toward the highway. The white SUV that had once cut across my ranch every morning followed behind it at a careful speed, staying firmly on the paved road where it belonged. I never saw Claire Phillips again. The ranch returned to its old rhythm not long after that. The mornings went back to being quiet. The cattle grazed along the fence line without jumping at the sound of an engine tearing down the hill. Boomer went back to sleeping on the porch instead of barking at traffic that didn't belong there. The trench Derek and I dug, eventually filled with rainwater and grass, began creeping across the edges until it blended naturally into the road again. If someone drove past the curve today, they might not even notice it, but I notice it every time I pass, because that small dip in the dirt carries the memory of the moment someone learned the difference between authority and ownership. People sometimes ask me if I regret digging that trench. The story traveled far enough through the county that strangers occasionally bring it up while we're standing in line feed store. They ask if it was worth all the trouble just to prove a point. The answer is always the same. It was never about proving a point. It was about protecting a boundary. Land teaches you something important if you spend enough years working. Every fence line, every gate, every path across the soil exists for a reason. Those boundaries aren't there to keep people out. They exist so everyone understands where their responsibility begins and where it ends. When someone ignores those lines long enough, the land eventually reminds them. Sometimes that reminder is quiet. Sometimes it's a broken sign, and sometimes it's a trench in the road that swallows the front half of a white SUV. Either way, the message is always the same. This land is mine. Claire Phillips went silent after that. Nobody argued again.